Hey guys, tonight we head deep into the heart of what most people think was the darkest, most miserable time in history, the Middle Ages. You know the cliché muddy roads, plague rats, toothless peasants muttering in Latin while everything smells faintly like turnips and despair. But here's the twist. What if it wasn't that dark after all? What if behind the stained glass windows, under the woolen cloaks and candlelight, something warm, smart, even kind of cozy was happening? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. Let's see who's drifting off, from where. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit on a low, uneven wooden bench in the corner of a medieval cottage. Your boots are off, drying by the hearth, and your cloak smells like damp wool and a hint of fried onions. Outside, it's pitch black, the kind of blackness that modern streetlights have made us forget. But inside, there's a warm glow from a clay lamp on the table, 2 candles flickering on the wall, and a roaring fire that crackles and pops like it's auditioning for an ASMR video. You're not squinting in darkness. You're basking in it, despite what you might have heard. The medieval world didn't stumble around in gloom like some low-budget zombie film. Candlelight was everywhere, made from tallow if you were on a budget, reed smelly or beeswax if you had money or a monastery hookup. Hearth fires blazed in homes. Torches, lits, marketplaces, and glass lanterns glimmered through windows like starlight bottled for a price. The term Dark Ages was mostly a later invention, an insult thrown backward by smug Renaissance humanists who thought the centuries before them lacked their sparkle. You shift closer to the fire. Watching how the shadows play along the beams overhead, there's a certain rhythm to the place. The rustle of straw underfoot, the low creak of the rafters. A rooster who has absolutely no idea what time it is. You'd think people just went to sleep at sundown back then. But nope. Medieval folks were night owls in their own way. They observed something historians now call segmented sleep, 2 separate phases of rest, with a wakeful period in between. That means around midnight. You'd wake up naturally, maybe pray, maybe have a snack, maybe whisper secrets in bed that you'd pretend to forget by morning. Sound familiar. And about the cities. Yes. They had dark alleys and crime, and occasional flying chamber pots. Watch your head. But they weren't without charm. Many towns had street lighting, of a kind. In Paris, by the 1300s, residents were ordered to hang lamps outside their homes. Some even paid candle-bearers to guide them home. It's not exactly a Tesla on autopilot. But hey, progress is progress. You step outside, wrapping your cloak tight as the chill hits you. The sky overhead is a thick velvet studded with stars. Actual stars, not just 5 bars of Wi-Fi. There's Orion. There's the Milky Way spilling across the sky like a silver ribbon. No light pollution here to spoil the view. You realize people back then knew the constellations intimately. Sailors navigated by them. Farmers planted by them. Even lovers promised things under them. The heavens were a nightly spectacle, no subscription required. Down the path, you see a glow warm orange light leaking from a tavern door. Inside, Laughter bursts like popcorn. You duck in and are immediately enveloped in smells roasted meat, wood smoke, and ale. A man plays a hurdy-gurdy near the hearth. A woman with braided hair and a wicked grin slams a pint in front of you without asking. You sip. It's warm. Spiced. Maybe slightly questionable. But comforting. You probably weren't expecting the Middle Ages to feel this alive. You're surrounded by noise and color. The clatter of wooden tankards and iron-tipped shoes on stone. It's not a lifeless time. It's just dimmer. In the best sense. The kind of dim that makes candlelight matter. That makes every glow deliberate. A man at the next table begins to read from a scroll. You lean in, surprised he's reciting poetry in the local dialect. Full of strange rhythm and earthy humor. People applaud when he finishes. Yes, literacy wasn't universal, but oral storytelling was thriving. In fact, most medieval folks had incredible memories. Trained from birth to hold verses and tales in their heads like living libraries. Not bad for a so-called dark time. You leave the tavern, a little tipsy, a little full, and a lot more impressed than you expected. On the way back, you pass a chapel glowing faintly from within. Candles flicker behind stained glass, casting ruby and sapphire reflections on the ground. Inside, monks chant in Latin. It's past midnight, but the building hums with activity. In the medieval world, sacred time didn't sleep. Bells rang at all hours. Vespers, matins, lauds. If you were in a monastery, your circadian rhythm belonged to God. You pause at the chapel door and peek in. Rows of candles line the altar. Their flames seem to float in air, reflected off polished chalices and gilded icons. The room smells of incense, resinous, heavy, with a hint of something floral. You inhale deeply, trying to remember every detail. Not dark, not dead, not empty, but vibrant, lit. Historians still argue whether the so-called Dark Ages were truly dark, or just dimmed by the later arrogance of those who came after. What's certain is this: if you lived then, you weren't stumbling in pitch black. You had firelight, faith, family. You had stars above, hearths within, and enough beeswax to keep the shadows friendly. You climb into your straw mattress, still a little itchy from the wool, but cozy, under a thick pile of woven blankets. The candle at your bedside flickers once, twice, then steadies. You're not afraid of the dark, because this isn't darkness, it's depth. And the glow in this room might just be brighter than anything you've known. You wake to the gentle scrape of a wooden shutter opening and the faint smell of porridge already simmering downstairs. Morning in your medieval cottage comes slowly, wrapped in mist and the muted chirp of birds who have no idea you went to sleep beside a mug of cider and a hurdy-gurdy. The candle by your bedside has burned low, but the soft light creeping in tells you it's time to stretch, yawn, and awkwardly stumble over the chamber pot. You pull on your tunic, scratch an itch you won't speak of, and glance toward the road. There, in the distance, sits something that looks a little like a castle, except smaller, quieter, and far more mysterious. It's a monastery, not the kind with fancy marble columns and lavish Renaissance art. But astute, stone-walled, slightly mossy building wrapped in a hedge of rose hips. You decide to pay it a visit, partly because you've heard they might be serving honeyed bread and partly because, despite what you assumed, this place holds the memory of books. Inside, the air is cool and reverent, like someone pressed pause on time. The scriptorium smells like ink, vellum, and patience. You tiptoe past robed monks, some squinting over pages with goose feather quills, others hunched so close to their work you'd think they were whispering secrets to the parchment. The scratching sound fills the room like a soft rain on old wood. This is where knowledge was rescued, one line at a time. During the chaos of Rome's fall, when roads collapsed and armies scattered like confetti in a storm, it was monasteries like this that kept the light on, not just spiritually, but intellectually. They copied Greek philosophy, Roman law, medical treatises, even the occasional eyebrow-raising bit of poetry that probably made the abbot raise a brow. Sure, they weren't perfect. Some monks edited out passages they didn't like, or inserted marginal doodles that ranged from the sublime to the suspiciously goat-themed. But without these copyists, we'd have lost much of Aristotle, Galen, and Boethius. Think of them as the world's most persistent librarians, except they had calligraphy and a very high tolerance for silence. You crouch beside one scribe, watching as he fills a page with careful black ink, then goes back and adds red for the headings. Illuminated capitals bloom in gold leaf and cobalt, each letter curling like ivy. You're not sure if you're reading a Bible, a treatise on astronomy, or the medieval equivalent of a TED Talk on how many angels can dance on a pinhead. Either way, it's mesmerizing. Some of the monks are using palimpsests, old parchment scraped clean and reused. You squint. Beneath the fresh ink, ghostly traces of older writing remain, like ancient whispers peeking through. Historians still argue whether this was out of necessity or quiet rebellion, a recycling of vellum, or an attempt to overwrite the past with holier narratives. At midday, the bells chime for sext, and the whole monastery shifts into prayer mode. You step outside, blinking into the sunlight. It's hard to imagine people calling this a dark time when the walls echo with Latin. The sky smells like rosemary from the herb garden, and the dining hall is serving barley stew with a side of psalms. You sit by a low wall and peer over at the monastic library. It's not fast, not even that organized, but it holds hundreds of manuscripts. Some are theological. Others are deeply practical plant guides, almanach, even medical recipes that involve crushed emeralds and advice like boil the patient in goat's milk. But only on Tuesdays. One manuscript contains yolks, bad ones. You feel strangely at home. The truth is, the early Middle Ages didn't snuff out learning. They just tucked it away where the candles wouldn't blow out. And as centuries passed, these humble places became intellectual powerhouses. Monasteries in Ireland, England, France, and beyond began trading books, compiling encyclopedias, and creating entire schools of thought. The Carolingian Renaissance, spearheaded by Charlemagne in the 8th century, saw a revival in classical education, art, and science, all nurtured by monastic scribes. You stand and stretch. A young novice jogs by, arms full of scrolls, and you imagine a modern student doing the same with library books. A frappuccino precariously balanced on top. Progress doesn't always look flashy. Sometimes it's a monk smudging his robes with ink in the name of preserving Herodotus. Later in the afternoon, a guest speaker arrives, an elderly scholar from Italy who's been studying Aristotle's De Anima. He joins the monks in the cloister, where benches creak under the weight of curiosity. You slip in at the edge, listening to Latin phrases peppered with warm laughter. The scholar talks of the soul, the senses, and the stars. You nod sagely, having understood maybe 12% of it. Still, you feel smarter just sitting there. And that's the thing, they wanted to understand the world. They didn't just pray to survive it. Knowledge was a form of devotion. Learning wasn't a luxury. It was salvation through syllables. One monk pulls you aside to show off their newest acquisition, a freshly copied manuscript of Pliny the Elder's natural history. "It's got everything," he says, with a gleam in his eye. "Volcanoes, elephants, how to find a unicorn." You try not to smirk. He's dead serious. As dusk descends, you're invited to Vespers. The chapel glows again, flickering like a lantern at sea. Voices rise and chant melancholy, haunting, and somehow comforting. You close your eyes and feel the music settle into your bones. It doesn't matter if you speak Latin. The rhythm of devotion crosses languages. You realize that this monastery, like many others, is part of a continent-wide network. Books travel, ideas flow, and in centuries to come, these copied works will ignite universities, spark reforms, and challenge empires, all because someone stayed up late with a quill and a prayer. You wander back toward your cottage beneath a twilight sky streaked with orange and indigo. Owls hoot softly in the trees. The darkness doesn't feel ominous now. It feels earned. Behind you, the monastery's windows still glow, small squares of gold in the distance. You smile, thinking of the monk who accidentally drew a snail fighting a knight in the margin of a holy manuscript. Not everything they copied was serious. Sometimes they just had fun. You wonder what they'd make of your world, with its emojis and autocorrect fails. Probably the same thing you think of theirs: strange, flawed, and full of meaning. So maybe this wasn't such a dark age after all. Maybe it was just lit differently. You rise a little later than usual, thanks to the soporific effects of barley stew, candlelight, and a Latin chant echoing in your dreams. The morning sun glints off dew-soaked hedgerows as you trudge along a muddy but well-trod path leading away from the monastery. A gentle breeze carries the scent of crushed thyme and sheep, a combination you're not quite ready to bottle. Today, you're headed to a place buzzing, not with prayers, but with lectures, debates, and the occasional well-aimed clump of bread. You're going to university. That's right. Universities exist in the Middle Ages. In fact, you're walking into one of the earliest: Bologna, Paris, or maybe Oxford. It doesn't really matter, because in all of them, the atmosphere is electric. Not literally. Of course, no one's invented that yet, but the intellectual current is real. You pass under archways where robed students shout Latin insults and rush toward morning disputations, like they're fighting for front-row seats at a medieval TEDx event. You instinctively duck as a flying apple thuds into a nearby pillar. Welcome to higher learning. The buildings are simple but sturdy. Lecture halls, smell of ink, wool, and stress. You're herded into a narrow stone room, perched awkwardly on a bench that threatens to turn your hips into question marks. At the front stands a magister robe swishing, beard authoritative, eyebrows arched like cathedral spires. He launches into a reading from Aristotle's Metaphysics, alternating between droning recitation and rapid-fire commentary. You try to keep up. It feels like drinking Latin from a fire hose. Still, There's something thrilling here. Students débattent fiercely, hurling ideas like snowballs in winter. They're not just memorizing, they're arguing. The disputatio format demands it. A thesis is stated. Objections are raised. Counter-arguments. Flung like verbal peas. You catch one scholar saying, "Well, if the soul can err, is it truly divine?" A gasp ripples through the room. You realize this is dangerous thinking, and that makes it even more exciting. Contrary to the myth that everyone in the Middle Ages feared inquiry, universities were full of it. Sure, theology reigned supreme, but law, medicine, and natural philosophy were close seconds. You wander down a side corridor and find a classroom mid-discussion about the humors blood, flame, yellow bile, and black bile. One student insists that too much black bile makes you melancholy. Another claims it just means you've been eating too many turnips. The professor grins, scribbles diagrams on a slate, and assigns them both more Galen to read. Later that day, you stumble into a cramped student lodging, stone walls, straw-stuffed mattress, half a loaf of rye bread in the corner. It's not glamorous, but it's vibrant. One roommate's reciting Virgil in Latin, while the other's carving lewd doodles into the windowsill. You share a chunk of cheese and trade insults that would make a monk blush. Not all students are rich. In fact, many are dirt poor. Some earn their keep by singing in churches, copying texts, or working as errand boys for professors. Others rely on the kindness of patrons or scholarships from their hometowns. The university is more than a school. It's a community, a proving ground, a social experiment wrapped in parchment. And here's the kicker. This system of degrees, bachelor, master, doctor, will echo for centuries. The robes you wear today will look suspiciously similar to the ones future students don for graduation photos. Awkward hats and all. Historians still argue whether the structure stifled creativity or preserved academic rigor. But either way, you're part of something that will stretch long past your time. You duck into the cathedral next to the university, a place of both worship and exams. Yes, some oral defenses happen right in front of the altar. Because who needs academic pressure when you can have divine judgment too? You watch a student sweating as he answers questions about Peter Lombard's sentences, voice shaking, eyes darting toward the stained glass saints for mercy. Afterward, he celebrates with friends by chugging cider in the courtyard. They break into a raucous rendition of the Carmina Burana, not the spooky choir part we know, but the original drinking songs. Bawdy and brilliant. You join in, even if your Latin's iffy. Everyone's a scholar after a few mugs of mead. As night falls, you retreat to a study nook tucked behind a cloistered garden. The stars emerge, one by one, and you spread open a borrowed manuscript on astronomy. Ptolemaic spheres dance across the vellum, each planet carefully labeled, Mars glowing a faded rust red under your candlelight. You wonder what it must be like to believe in a universe of crystalline spheres and perfectly divine order. Comforting. Maybe. Like a bedtime story for the cosmos. Then you hear it rustling footsteps, followed by muffled laughter. A group of students appears, cloaks flapping like bat wings. One of them carries a scroll under his arm and proposes a midnight disputation by torchlight. The moon, it declares, is not perfect, gasps. You love it. It's a hot take for 1,273. They argue under the stars, quoting Aristotle, Averroes, and even sneaking in a few lines from forbidden texts. It's spirited, maybe even a little foolish, but it's alive. This isn't a time of silence and fear. It's a time of curiosity fighting its way through dogma, often with more success than you'd guess. The next morning, you visit the university's small library. It's cramped, poorly lit, and smells like goat, skin, and ink. But it's also a treasure chest. Books are chained to the shelves, not for punishment, just to prevent theft. You stroke the spine of one, surprised by how soft the leather feels. Inside are diagrams of human anatomy, scribbled marginalia, arguing with the main text, and a note from one reader calling the author a pompous windbag. Intellectual sass is timeless. You help a scholar sort through a crate of books recently arrived from Spain. These are translations of Arabic texts, Averroes, Avicenna, Al-Khwarizmi. Their work has traveled across cultures and languages, bringing with it medicine, astronomy, algebra. You marvel at the illustrations of surgical tools and celestial bodies. The idea that medieval Europe was sealed off from the world suddenly seems laughable. One student whispers that studying these texts can be risky. Some church officials worry about heresy, but others welcome the knowledge. It's a tightrope walk. You realize how often real history happens in the tension between risk and reward, between copying Plato and questioning him. As you leave the university, you glance back at the courtyard filled with arguing scholars, hungover students, and ambitious minds. No one's inventing the iPhone here, but they are laying the groundwork for an intellectual world that still shapes yours. They're asking questions. They're pushing boundaries. They're daring to wonder. And that, perhaps, is the brightest light of all. You follow the dusty road out of town, past students still arguing about metaphysics and a goose that's made itself king of the alley. Your feet ache. Your head spins with Latin syllogisms. And you seriously consider whether medieval boots were secretly instruments of penance. But then, you see it rising in the distance, a mountain of stone, glass, and impossible geometry. A Gothic cathedral. You stop walking. You just stare. The first thing you notice is the height. It seems to pierce the sky, like it's trying to whisper in heaven's ear. Spires shoot upward. Flying buttresses arc like frozen wings. Gargoyles leer from high corners, their expressions stuck somewhere between mischief and indigestion. The cathedral doesn't just sit on the land, it dominates it. It makes your mouth fall open, your brain temporarily disconnect, and your spine. Remember what awe feels like. You edge closer, neck craned, so far back it starts to cramp. The stone is cool under your fingers, worn smooth in places by generations of hands. You pass beneath a massive tympanum over the front door, Jesus in the center, surrounded by apostles, saints, and people who definitely look like they're regretting their life choices. Every figure has movement. Robes ripple, eyes widen, feet hover just off the ground, like they're about to walk off the stone. These aren't just decorations, they're sermons in sculpture. Inside, it takes a moment for your eyes to adjust. Light isn't just pouring in, it's being transformed. Stained glass windows stretch from floor to ceiling, casting long pools of ruby, sapphire, and emerald light across the flagstones. Sunbeams get filtered through stories: the creation, the nativity, the Last Judgment. Each panel is a comic strip for the illiterate. You wander between columns so tall, They seem to vanish into mist. The whole place smells like incense. Old wood and damp stone. You can hear your heartbeat echoing in the hush. This cathedral didn't appear overnight. It took decades, sometimes centuries, to build. Entire generations of stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, and laborers dedicated their lives to it. You pause to watch a mason chip away at a block of limestone in the cloister. His hands calloused, his chisel steady. He offers you a turn. You accept. Your first strike nearly takes off your thumb. He laughs and shakes his head. Patience, he says. It's not built in a day. The construction site is a chaos of genius. Pulleys creak. Hoists sway. Oxen grunt. People are climbing scaffolding that would never pass a safety inspection today. But they're doing it. They're literally building upward, not just in stone, but in spirit. And here's the surprise. They know what they're doing. Medieval architects had advanced knowledge of weight distribution, stress points, and materials. They designed pointed arches not for drama, but because they transferred weight more efficiently. Ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and stained glass weren't aesthetic afterthoughts, they were technical innovations. Historians still argue whether these methods were rediscovered from Roman blueprints or developed entirely anew. But the result is undeniable. These structures endure. You stumble into a small side chapel, where a glazier is repairing a broken panel of stained glass. Tiny shards of colored glass sit in little piles, waiting to be fitted into a lead framework. She holds up a new piece, a shard of deep cobalt, letting the light filter through it onto your hand. It feels like touching the sky. You ask how long it will last. She shrugs. Maybe another 600 years. Give or take. Even the floor tells stories. Stone slabs engraved with names and dates stretch beneath your feet. One of them reads simply, "Here lies a mason who never spoke, but whose hands shaped angels." You feel that in your chest. At noon, a choir begins to sing. The acoustics catch the notes and toss them skyward. Polyphony, several voices weaving in and out of each other. No one dominating. No one lost. It feels like a sonic metaphor for society complex. Chaotic. Unexpectedly beautiful. You sit on a hard wooden pew that still somehow feels holy. This wasn't just a building for worship, it was the medieval equivalent of an IMAX experience. Light, sound, architecture, and sacred story, all choreographed into reverence. Outside, you follow a procession around the cathedral grounds. Children scatter petals on the path. A priest waves incense, like he's trying to bless the air itself. Merchants and masons kneel together. For a moment, every status, every grudge, every unpaid debt vanishes. They're unified in something bigger than themselves. You get talking to one of the builders. A wiry man named Emeric, with dust in his beard and laughter in his eyes. He tells you about the Guild of Masons, how they share knowledge, train apprentices, and guard their craft like it's sacred scripture. He explains that some builders leave tiny carved signatures on the stones, marks only fellow masons would recognize. You later spot one, a little spiral chiseled into the side of a pillar. It's like a medieval version of a graffiti tag, or a quiet "I was here." As the sun sets, the cathedral transforms again. Light strikes the windows at sharp angles, sending kaleidoscopic patterns across the walls like divine disco balls. A group of pilgrims arrives, exhausted but glowing. One of them clutches a tiny silver reliquary, shaped like a foot. You raise an eyebrow. Saint Crispin's too. He whispers. Reverently. You choose not to question it. Dinner that evening is served in the shadow of the cathedral. Bread, cheese, and thin ale on a wooden plank. You sit with glaziers, masons, and scribes. They talk shop how to carve a perfect arch. Which quarry has the best limestone? Why the gargoyle shaped like a goose keeps disappearing? You laugh. You listen. If you chew bread that could probably break a tooth. The sky darkens. Stars blink on. The cathedral looms behind you. Solemn and glowing. You realize this place wasn't built because it was easy. It was built because people believed it mattered. And in building it, they created not just a monument, but a message. That beauty can rise from mud. That light can pour through broken glass. That humans, when working together, when dreaming upward, can do the impossible. You fall asleep in the mason's quarters. The sound of distant chanting echoing through stone walls. Outside your window, the spire points to the stars. Unwavering, not bad for the so-called Dark Ages. You awaken to a hammering that isn't quite musical, and definitely isn't subtle. It's the steady, rhythmic pounding of skilled hands, shaping wood and metal. And it guides you down a winding lane past shuttered windows and dangling signs painted with loaves, tankards, and suspiciously smug pigs. You're entering the heart of a medieval city, not its castle, not its cathedral, but its workshop soul. You're heading to the Guildhall. Now, this isn't some drab bureaucracy with forms and lines and indifferent clerks. This is the buzzing center of production, reputation, and social ambition. As you step through the arched doorway, you're hit with a swirl of scents, pine sawdust, warm wax, a bit of varnish, and something tangy that you hope is linseed oil and not regret. Candles glow against polished beams. Tools hang in neat rows. Apprentices sweep up shavings with the hyper-awareness of people who know one slip could get them reclassified as a cautionary tale. Guilds are everywhere in the medieval city. If you can make it, bake it, sew it, pour it, or hammer it into usefulness. There's a guild for it. Bakers, masons, cobblers, tanners, candle makers, goldsmiths, coopers. Even the tooth drawer has a society, although you suspect that one's mostly for comparing scream volumes. You join the carpenters for the morning, rolling up your sleeves as they measure, cut, and curse over a lopsided cart axle. Here's the surprise. It's not chaotic. It's ordered. It's structured. There are ranks: apprentice, journeyman, master, and a strict code of conduct. Masters oversee quality, handle disputes, and keep their shops running like early capitalism with a side of ale. Journeymen travel, gathering experience and gossip from other towns. Apprentices start young and sleep in corners, next to piles of kindling and the occasional half-carved chicken. It's intense, but it's also upwardly mobile. That's right. Social mobility exists here. If you've got the skills, the discipline, and a talent for not sawing your thumb off, you can rise through the ranks and make a name for yourself. Some guild members become so wealthy, they rival the nobility trading silk, commissioning chapels, and throwing weddings so grand, they're still muttered about decades later. You walk over to the candlemaker's section, where a woman named Aldith is dipping fresh tapers into vats of hot tallow. The room smells like a barn on fire, but she works with a practiced grace. She's a master in her own right, having inherited the business from her mother. You ask how long it took her to get here. 12 years and 3 singed eyebrows. She grins. The guild recognized her not because of her lineage, but her craftsmanship, and that matters in a world where surnames and silk usually determine everything. She shows you the guild book, a thick volume chained to the wall, where names, symbols, and codes of ethics are written out in looping script. There are fines for cutting corners, consequences for cheating customers, and records of disputes settled over bread, coins, and on one memorable occasion, a duel involving pastry tongs. You realize that guilds are proto-unions, chambers of commerce, and medieval LinkedIn, all rolled into one. You wander out into the street, ducking, as a boy nearly runs you over with a cart full of barrels. You follow him to the cooper's yard, where men are assembling barrels with the intensity of surgeons and the language of sailors. Every trade has its rhythm. The metallic ping of hammer against hoop, the soft thud of staves sliding into place, the creak of wood tightening in the sun. It's symphonic in its own splintery way. Lunchtime comes fast. You sit with blacksmiths and leatherworkers at a long communal table in the hall. Bread is torn. Ale is passed. And stories fly like arrows at a tourney. One smith talks about an order from a distant noble for horseshoes made of bronze ridiculous, impractical, but gold-lined and profitable. Another boasts about a chandelier he crafted for a cathedral choir, each arm shaped like a singing saint. You realize this isn't just labor. It's art. There's laughter, but also tension. Competition between guilds can get spicy. The shoemakers and the tanners are feuding again, something about who ruined whose delivery cart. The weavers mutter about undercutting, and the glaziers are still bitter about being blamed for that church fire 2 years ago, which may or may not have involved a rogue magnifying glass. Historians still argue whether some of these rivalries were friendly spats or full-on trade warfare. You suspect a bit of both. In the afternoon, the hall transforms into a courtroom of sorts. A journeyman is brought forward, accused of selling subpar combs with splinters still inside. The guild elders listen, stroke their beards, and eventually render judgment 2 weeks unpaid work and mandatory comb sanding duty. It's harsh. 2. Boot fair. Quality matters here. A shoddy product doesn't just shame you, it shames your whole guild. You help a weaver prepare her presentation for admission. As a master, she lays out her best work. A tapestry of silk and wool depicting St. Bresson, George, a hedgehog, and something that might be a pineapple. It's stunning. She's nervous. You realize this is her moment, a test of her years, her hands, and her ability to convince a jury of exacting experts that she belongs. She passes. There's applause, cider, and a goose parade. It's a thing. That night, the guild hall hosts a feast. Long table say, on a roast duck, root vegetables, honeyed pears, and enough bread to reconstruct a small tower. Music drifts in from a fiddler outside. The masters toast. The apprentices sneak sips. You sit with a candle maker and a goldsmith, laughing over who's got the sootier hands. It feels like family. It feels earned. Later, by candlelight, You browse through a pile of rejected guild emblems, one with a loaf that looks like a potato, one with a goat playing a harp, and one that's just a single angry spoon. Even failure is remembered here. As you leave the hall, the streets are quieter. The city exhales, but the guilds don't sleep. Somewhere, an apprentice is still sanding. A weaver is threading. A cooper is dreaming of perfect hoops. You realize that while kings and lords made the rules, it was these hands, these stubborn, skillful, sauce-covered hands that kept the world spinning. Not dark, not forgotten, just built from the ground up. One candle, one comb, one clumsy apprentice at a time. You sleep in a modest garret above the candlemaker's shop, warm under a patchwork quilt that smells faintly of beeswax and lavender. As dawn peeks through the crooked shutters, the city begins to stir hooves on cobbles. Vendors shouting about onions like they're rare gemstones. And somewhere, a cat yowling like it just discovered theology. You yawn, stretch, and begin the day with a walk toward the market, only this time, you're looking not just for bread or gossip, but for someone history often forgets. A woman, specifically, a woman with agency, with clout, with her sleeves rolled up and zero time for your assumptions. Because, while history tends to paint medieval women as permanently stuck churning butter or dying quietly in childbirth, the actual story is trickier. You dodge a fish cart and round the corner to a bustling row of market stalls, where a merchant named Cecily is already mid-argument with a red-faced customer over the price of Flemish wool. Cecily's not just selling cloth, she's managing inventory, hiring assistants, negotiating with suppliers, and expertly ignoring men who try to mansplain trade routes. Her husband died 2 winters ago, and she kept the business not because the guild allowed it, but because she's that good. In fact, widows like Cecily often stepped into commercial roles. The law varied depending on region, guild, and mood of the local magistrate. But women could own property, inherit shops, and wield real economic power. Some even ran shipping companies or financed cathedral windows. And no, they didn't all dress like nuns on laundry day. Cecily rocks a cranberry-colored overdress that screams, "Yes, this cost a lot." And no, you can't afford it. You tag along as she counts coins, tests, die samples, and bullies a scribe into correcting a badly written invoice. She sighs at your expression. "What did you expect?" she asks. "That we just churned butter and fainted?" You try to say something clever, but end up carrying a bolt of wool to her storage, shed out of sheer guilt. In the town square, you spot another unexpected figure, a midwife, dressed in gray with a basket of herbs. Surrounded by women, asking her advice. She listens, nods, and passes out little bundles tied in twine, one for cramps, one for fevers, one for a neighbor who's convinced a ghost stole her appetite. The midwife is part healer, part therapist, part town gossip depository. Her knowledge is encyclopedic, her hands firm, her expression one of practiced neutrality. You learn that midwives were often licensed, trusted, and paid not by the church, but by communities that needed them. Sure, they got side-eyed by suspicious clergymen now and then, but when your baby's breech or your husband's suddenly covered in boils, you don't call a theologian, You call her. Back at the edge of town, a group of women is weaving baskets by the river. One of them, Margot, tells you her daughter is in training to be an abbess. She's already better at Latin than the local priest. She says, with a grin, and it's true. Some convents were hotbeds of literacy, diplomacy, and quietly radical ideas. Nuns copied texts, advised rulers, and ran schools. One abbess you read about wrote treatises on medicine, music, and theology, all while managing estates and organizing pilgrims. That's not piety, it's management. You sit under a willow tree, as Margot explains, that the convent is where her daughter can live without some man interrupting her every 5 minutes. You nod, slowly, realizing that medieval feminism may have looked different, but it definitely existed. Later that afternoon, you pass a group of young girls practicing dance steps in the courtyard of a large merchant house. Their teacher is a former court musician with a lute, a quick temper, and a flair for sarcasm. She's also very much in charge. These girls are being trained not just in dance, but in letters, etiquette, math, and what to do if someone tries to marry them for their dowry. The lesson includes a sharp lesson in eyebrow raising and the strategic use of silence. You're pretty sure at least 3 of them could out-negotiate a bishop. Over dinner, you're invited to a home owned by Isabeau, a wealthy widow who now funds almshouses and even a chapel or 2. Her dining room is decorated with tapestries depicting scenes from the lives of female saints, plus one that appears to be Judith holding a sword with a slightly smug expression. You ask if that was her idea. She shrugs. Sometimes. Men need reminding. As you sip warm, spiced wine, she tells you about her travels to Bruges, her frustration with land taxes, and how she once convinced a merchant to triple his price just so she could buy his goods at a discount later when they didn't sell. She's not cruel, just brilliant. And she's not alone. From laundresses to moneylenders, women shape this world in ways your school textbooks conveniently skipped. Of course, life wasn't perfect. Women still faced enormous barriers, inheritance disputes, legal restrictions, and a church that could never quite decide whether they were holy vessels or tempting doom goblins. Historians still argue whether medieval women had consistent rights or whether exceptions like Isabeau and Cecily just prove the rule. But the evidence is there in tax records, guild rolls, letters, court cases. Not every woman had power, but some wielded it with remarkable precision. You end your evening with a visit to the spinning house, where a dozen women work by lamplight, twisting thread and humming old songs. One of them hums a tune about a baker's daughter who tricks the devil. Another laughs at the twist ending. You realize these are their stories, their folklore, their legacy, their subtle rebellion, wrapped in yarn and rhyme. As you walk back through the lamplit streets, the air cools, and the candles in windows flicker like stars. You think about the lives hidden behind each door, some quiet, some loud, all complex. The idea that medieval women were passive background characters just doesn't hold up. They worked, prayed, created, healed, led. They raised children and crops, and occasionally hell. You pass Cecily's shop again. The shutters are closed now, but the smell of dye and ambition still lingers in the air. You smile, knowing she'll be up before dawn again, counting coins and holding her own, and you realize history may have forgotten their names, but the world they shaped is still standing. You wake to the sound of chickens arguing under your window, and the distant creak of a mill wheel turning in rhythm with the river. The city has faded behind you now, replaced by an open stretch of countryside that looks suspiciously like a painting you once saw in a museum rolling hills. Neat furrows, and enough sheep to make your socks blush. Today, you're headed into the fields, not to admire the scenery, but to survive on it, because for all the books, cathedrals, and gilded tapestries, most of medieval life is rooted in one very muddy, very essential thing: agriculture. Your guide today is a wiry man named Edric, with wind-chapped cheeks and hands like well-sanded fence posts. He hands you a hoe, raises an eyebrow, and points to a plot of land dotted with young sprouts. "That's your row," he says. You glance at your boots, then at your row. It's long, so long. You begin to suspect medieval people were powered entirely by determination and turnips. But there's more to it than mindless digging. Edric's land isn't just a patchwork of random fields. It's part of a meticulously managed system called the open field method. And here's the surprise. They knew what they were doing. The land is divided into strips, shared, communally, and rotated over time through a method so logical it feels like a spreadsheet come to life. You spend the morning planting beans and barley, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of what's known as the three-field system, 2 fields in use. One left fallow. Later, this will become a 4-field rotation, which will blow agricultural minds. This wasn't backward subsistence farming. It was collaborative, planned, and shockingly efficient. It allowed for more food, healthier soil, and fewer people going full Oliver Twist during winter. Edric explains that if you treat the soil right, it returns the favor. If you don't, well, you end up with weeds, resentment, and a reputation as that idiot who ruined the barley. You pause to wipe your brow. The sun is high, but it's not oppressive. The air smells of earth and rosemary, with a side of sheep. You ask Edric if they ever dream of city life. He shrugs. Tried it once. Too loud. Too many people pretending to know Latin. Fair point. By midday, it's time to visit the manor mill, a key feature of rural economic life. You follow Edric to a low stone building by the river, its wheels spinning lazily. Inside, sacks of grain are dumped, ground, bagged again. It's noisy, dusty, and slightly hypnotic. The miller nods at you, but doesn't stop working. He's one of the busiest men in the village, and one of the most gossiped about. Everyone needs him, but no one entirely trusts him. He's got soft hands. Someone mutters. Suspicious. You learn that peasants are required to use the Lord's mill, paying a portion of their flour as fee. It's one of several dues they owe, alongside plowing fields, harvesting crops, and attending to the Lord's domain. It sounds harsh, but Edric explains it's more symbiotic than servile. The manor provides protection, tools, shared animals, and community events with surprisingly good cheese. It's not a utopia, but it's not pure oppression either. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were exploited victims or savvy negotiators within a rigid system. Edric, he just calls it Tuesday. Back at the village, you share a noon meal under a canopy of woven branches. Bread, cheese, onions, and something that might once have been cabbage. It's simple, but filling. Everyone shares what they have. You're startled by how much laughter there is. Even the pig seems in a good mood. In the afternoon, you help with the sheep. By help, you mostly mean stand very still while one of them headbutts your kneecap. But you observe how the animals are moved from pasture to pasture, common land that belongs to no single person. But to the village as a whole, there are rules for this. How many animals each family can graze, where fences must go, and what happens if your cow eats someone else's beets. Hint, it involves public shaming and a lot of shouting. It's a balance between freedom and order, personal need and shared resource. You ask if the community ever breaks down. Edric grins. Only at weddings. As evening comes, you join a small crowd assembling near a bonfire. It's the Feast of Plough Monday. Marking the start of the agricultural year, people wear garlands of straw, carry symbolic tools, and sing songs with lyrics that appear to change depending on how much ale is in circulation. A boy dressed as the Lord of Misrule prances around throwing handfuls of oats. You get hit in the face. It feels like a blessing. Probably. There's dancing. Not elegant, courtly waltzes, but hearty, stomping circle dances where rhythm is optional and laughter mandatory. The music comes from a fiddle, a drum, and a woman playing a bone whistle with the focus of a cathedral organist. You join in, clumsily, and somehow end up twirling a girl named Winifred, who's got flour on her cheek and no patience for your soft hands. The fire crackles. The stars blink on. You realize that life here is hard. Yes, but not joyless. Not dumb. Not static. These people know their world. They coax it into feeding them with care, rituals, and a surprising amount of local drama. Before bed, Edric shows you the records kept by the manor reeve, a kind of elected peasant official who tracks dues, disputas, and grain yields. The writing is basic, but clear. Someone has drawn a small sketch of a smug-looking pig next to the entry for missing bacon. You chuckle and imagine future historians finding this and arguing over its meaning. Was it satire, symbolism, or just very accurate? You climb into a hayloft above the livestock, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smells like lanolin and faintly of goat. Outside, an owl hoots. The fields rest. Tomorrow, the cycle begins again. Not glamorous, not revolutionary, but deeply human. And you realize the so-called Dark Ages fed themselves not through ignorance, but through innovation, not through conquest, but collaboration. Their nights may have been lit by torches, but their fields were clever. You wake with straw in your hair, and a slightly judgmental chicken eyeing you from a nearby beam. The barn creaks as the morning wind slides through its cracks, carrying with it a scent that isn't quite local, spicy, sweet, a little earthy. You blink, sit up, and sniff again. Is that cinnamon? You scramble out of the loft, trailing bits of hay and dignity, and follow the scent through the fields toward the village green. Something unusual is happening. Something that smells like it came from far, far away. As you reach the village square, you see a cart surrounded by curious townsfolk. It's covered in cloths of vivid color, deep saffron, sea green, crimson, and on it, a man in a turbaned cap is handing out tiny samples of pepper, cloves, and dried orange peel. The children wrinkle their noses. The adults raise eyebrows. The baker immediately starts haggling. You've just stumbled into the tail end of a trade caravan. This is how ideas and goods from far-off lands make their way into sleepy towns slowly. Through spice pouches and silk bolts, through stories told over campfires, through merchants with calloused hands and wildly exaggerated tales. You grab a pinch of nutmeg from the trader's basket, sniff it, and suddenly, your memories of modern holiday cookies feel wildly out of place here. This one tiny spice had to travel over thousands of miles of danger, taxes, and creative exaggeration. No wonder it's worth more than gold. You sit beside the merchant as he unpacks his wares. He speaks several languages, counts on an abacus, and references cities you've only heard in bedtime stories. Baghdad, Constantinople, Samarkand. He mentions routes that stretch across the known world, winding through desert, forest, and sea. He's part of a long, complex supply chain known today as the Silk Road, though. As he points out with a grin, not everything they carry is silk, and it's less of a road and more of a chaotic, well-traveled spider web. Contrary to the isolationist myth, medieval Europe was in constant conversation with the wider world. The fall of Rome didn't unplug the continent, it just changed the channels, and by the high Middle Ages, trade was roaring back to life. Italian city-states, like Venice and Genoa, became powerhouses, using sleek galleys to ferry everything from sugar to ideas across the Mediterranean. You learn that pepper from India, silk from China, and even paper from the Islamic world were becoming familiar luxuries to Europe's upper crust, and occasionally, if they were lucky, to the rest. You walk with the merchant to the edge of town where a few more wagons are parked. He introduces you to his traveling companions, a quiet woman who handles accounting with lethal precision, a Moorish herbalist who claims to have cured a horse with garlic and song, and a translator who speaks 8 languages but refuses to touch eels. You sit with them by the fire, listening as they share stories, a ship lost in a storm, a border bribe paid in soap, a city where the walls are tiled in blue, and every rooftop sings when it rains. One of the most surprising things is how many of the imported goods aren't just pretty, they're practical. You examine a roll of damask fabric, woven so tightly it could deflect wind. You taste sugar that isn't raw and brown, but powdered and light as snow. You even try on a strange little pair of glasses from Florence. The merchant says which make distant things clearer and near things blurrier. Congratulations. You've just met your first pair of spectacles. Over lunch, the merchant's translator opens a leather-bound volume, Arabic script on one side, Latin on the other. It's a text on medicine, full of diagrams of organs and herbal remedies that sound more effective than leeches. You learn that many of these works were translated in Moorish Spain, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked together in a rare moment of cross-cultural brilliance. Historians still argue whether this convivencia was genuine harmony or an uneasy truce. But its intellectual fruits are undeniable. Algebra, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, all came pouring into Europe through this window. You walk through the village with your new companions, showing them the mill, the chapel, and the inn, where the landlord's idea of exotic cuisine is boiled meat with extra salt. The merchant chuckles and offers to trade him a pinch of saffron for a room discount. The innkeeper sniffs the saffron, shrugs, and agrees. Later, he'll charge twice the usual rate for golden stew. That evening, the village gathers around the wagons. There's music, pipes, and drums from instruments you can't name. There's food cooked with actual cumin and coriander. One child tries a date and immediately spits it into a bush. The merchant shrugs. They're not for everyone. You speak to a local priest who seems both suspicious and intrigued by the visitors. He worries about foreign influence, but admits the new ink the scribe received is far superior to the stuff made from boiled bark. He mutters something about the East, with the same tone people reserve for both paradise and plumbing disasters. You smile politely and offer him a clove, which he sneezes out of his nose and blames on demons. Later, a story circle forms by the fire. The merchant tells a tale of a sea captain who navigated by stars and fish patterns. The herbalist speaks of a city where shadows point the wrong way at noon. A local midwife chimes in with a tale of a dream she once had that matched the stars exactly. You realize trade doesn't just carry goods. It carries mythologies, maps, methods, and mischief. Someone pulls out a lute. Another begins to chant a poem in a language you don't know, but feel anyway. And, as the moon rises over the wagons, you think the medieval world wasn't sealed off in some damp, candlelit ignorance. It was breathing in the world slowly, sometimes awkwardly, but always with curiosity. You sleep that night, under a borrowed wool cloak by the edge of the caravan. The stars overhead are so bright they look painted. You think of spices tucked in saddlebags, scrolls, crossing borders, conversations that span from India to Iberia. You remember that cinnamon you smelled first thing in the morning. It came from Sri Lanka. It passed through a dozen hands, sailed over oceans, crossed deserts, bribed customs agents, dodged thieves, and somehow ended up here. In your nose, in your soup, in your memory. The so-called Dark Ages. They had open windows, and the breeze carried cinnamon. You rise to the familiar sounds of village life, the clatter of carts, the braying of a mule with opinions, and someone loudly regretting last night's spiced stew. But there's something else in the air this morning. It's clean. Not like lemon-scented disinfectant clean, but fresh-baked bread and wild thyme kind of clean. You step outside and realize why. The bathhouse is open. Yes, you heard that right? A public bathhouse. You follow the scent of steam and the vague musical hum of someone singing off-key, winding your way through cobbled lanes until you reach a low-timbered building with smoke rising from a tile chimney. You push through the door and are immediately enveloped in a cloud of hot mist. Rosemary, and something that might be eucalyptus or just very confident turnip soap. Inside, the air is thick and warm. People chat, wash, soak, scrub, and occasionally play dice on flat stones. This isn't just hygiene, it's social. You're offered a wooden bucket, a bar of soap made with animal fat and lavender, and a rough linen towel that could double as sandpaper. And you dive in, figuratively. Of course, nobody cannonballs in medieval bathhouses unless they want to get publicly shamed by an old man named Osric. The idea that the Middle Ages were a non-stop grime fest is one of those stubborn myths that just won't die. Like the belief that everyone thought the earth was flat, or that people in the past didn't have sarcasm. In truth, bathing was a part of daily life, especially in towns. Bathhouses were common across Europe, from England to Bohemia. Some were run privately, some were municipal. and a few were even owned by monasteries that apparently understood cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was also good PR. You pick a tub deep, wooden, warm. Someone ladles steaming water over your shoulders. And suddenly, centuries of misinformation start to rinse away. There are herbs floating in the water mint. Sage. A stray flower petal. It's quiet here, except for the splash of water and the soft murmur of conversation. A woman beside you is telling her neighbor about her son's apprenticeship. Another man grumbles about a shipment of spoiled fish. You notice that everyone seems relaxed, peaceful, even. Bathhouses were a place not just to get clean, but to catch up on gossip, seal business deals, and occasionally flirt. Some towns even had rules to prevent inappropriate frolicking, which, based on the side-eye being exchanged between the baker and the blacksmith's widow, weren't always enforced. You're handed a stiff bristled brush and told to scrub like you mean it. You do, and quickly discover muscles you didn't know existed. A young boy walks by carrying warm stones in a basket to keep the tubs hot. He tosses one into a metal cauldron, and steam rises like a genie with sinus issues. After the soak, it's time for the dry room. You wrap yourself in your linen towel and move into a chamber warmed by a stove and lined with benches. There's a tray of herbal salves nearby, and someone offers you a mixture that smells like garlic and beeswax. You hesitate. It's for the joints, he says. You apply it. Your elbow now smells like a salad dressing. But it works. You ask if this is a normal thing. Every week, says a man with damp hair and a towel around his middle. Twice if you're lucky. More if you're rich or particularly offensive. He chuckles. There's a reason they call it the stew day. Apparently, some bathhouses offer light meals between scrubbing and soaking. Others, particularly in cities like Paris, Prague, and London, turn into lively evening spots, with music, games, and a mildly scandalous reputation. You learn that in medieval Islamic cities, bathhouses or hammams are even more developed, gorgeous tiled interiors, domed roofs, and rituals that combine purification, prayer preparation, and spa-level relaxation. Crusaders returning from the East brought back more than just stories, they brought bathing habits. So much for barbarism. Still, it wasn't always squeaky clean. There were complaints about bathhouse behaviors, accusations of immorality, and occasional outbreaks of lice, which prompted more washing, not less. And when the plague hit in the 14th century, some cities temporarily shuttered their bathhouses out of fear that heat opened the skin to disease. Historians still argue whether this was a protective measure or just another way of blaming nice things for bad outcomes. Either way, people returned to the baths as soon as the panic eased because, well, nobody likes being itchy in chainmail. As you dry off and pull your tunic back over your now pruned limbs, someone hands you a comb carved from bone and points to a mirror blurry, slightly cracked, but serviceable. You catch your reflection. You look cleaner. Sure, but you also look a little smug, like someone who's just found out that filthy peasants might have been more hygienic than most modern campers. Back outside, the air feels cool against your skin. A group of children is playing near the village well, their faces streaked with dust and their laughter echoing off stone walls. One girl runs up to you and thrusts a small pot of rosewater into your hands. For later, she says, then scampers away. You uncap it and take a whiff. It smells divine. You make a mental note to not spill it, sell it, or accidentally drink it. You follow the footpath past laundry strung between apple trees and see rows of cloth flapping in the breeze. Washing days are communal events. Everyone gathers near the river, scrubs linen against worn stones, and talks about whose goose wandered off, and whether the Baron's new wife is truly as pale as alabaster or just allergic to sun. Clean clothes, like clean bodies, are part of the rhythm here. Soap, ash lye, and even imported powders are used not daily, but often enough to make the dirty peasant trope look more like Renaissance propaganda than truth. You help hang a blanket that smells like sunshine and thyme, and someone hands you a cup of water flavored with mint. It's cold. It's refreshing. And you've never been more aware of how much we underestimate the past. That night, you return to your borrowed room with your rosewater pot, your scrubbed skin, and a newfound respect for medieval grooming. You lie back on your pallet and think of the bathhouse, the laughter, the warmth, the faint echo of splashing. Not a world of filth, not a dark age of stink and fleas. Just people, figuring out how to feel human, one warm bath at a time. You wake to a soft thumping outside your window, a rhythm more musical than alarming. It's early still, but the village is already awake. Today's not a day for fields or markets. Today is for music. You sit up slowly, still feeling the lingering warmth of yesterday's bath, and you're greeted by the sound of a flute trill. Then the pluck of lute strings floating in the breeze, like a soundtrack, the medieval world queued up just for you. As you pull on your tunic and step into the square, you find it transformed. Colored ribbons sway from poles. Garlands wrap around doorposts, and the cobbles are swept clean, for once probably to prevent someone face-planting mid-revel. A group of musicians stands near the tavern, tuning instruments and mock-arguing about tempo. One of them, a woman with a hurdy-gurdy, the size of a small boar, grins at you and gestures you closer. We're warming up. Care to try a tambourine? You accept. You immediately regret it. Medieval music wasn't all solemn chants and dirges. Yes? Gregorian chant was the bread and butter of the monastery's calm. Celestial, echoing through stone chapels at odd hours, but outside those cloisters, the musical world was full of color, mischief, and rhythm. There were minstrels, troubadours, jongleurs, and the occasional traveling musical oddball with a monkey and a set of ankle bells. You follow one group of them as they roam from door to door, playing cheerful melodies and collecting coins, pastries, and, occasionally, someone's attention. You pause to listen to a minstrel singing a tale of doomed lovers, two nobles who fall for each other across a battlefield and end up turning their lances on their own armies. Historically dubious, but musically excellent. The tune is in Dorian mode, and even though you can't name it, you feel it that bittersweet, haunting quality that feels half lullaby, half lament. You lean against a wall and let it wash over you. A girl beside you hums along. She tells you she's learning to sing in parts polyphony. They call it the idea that voices don't have to mirror each other but can wander, weave, argue a little, then come back together. It's catching on in churches, chapels, even royal courts. Historians still argue whether this was a homegrown European development or borrowed from Byzantine or Islamic musical traditions. But either way, it's beautiful. You imagine what it must have sounded like the first time people heard it two voices instead of one. a harmony where before there had only been unison. It must have felt like magic, or at least like discovering your ears had been bored all along. You wander toward the church for the midday service, partly out of curiosity, and partly because you heard they've got a new organ. It's a small one, pipes no bigger than your arm. Bellows worked by an apprentice who looks about 12 and very sweaty, but the sound is crisp, floating on the incense-laced air like bubbles. The choir begins to sing, voices rising and falling like gentle surf. You don't know the words, but the feeling is unmistakable peace. Reverence. The sort of collective breath that happens when humans stop talking and start listening together. And yet, just as sacred as the church, music is what happens later. Down by the tavern, the musicians reconvene. This time, there's a drum, a psaltery, and a bagpipe that looks vaguely like a goat having an existential crisis. They strike up a saltarello, and before long, the entire square is moving. Children twirl, adults stomp. One baker does a jig so enthusiastically, his hat goes flying into a basket of pears. You're pulled into the rhythm, tambourine in hand, trying to follow the beat while not stepping on anyone's toes. It's impossible not to grin. Music here isn't reserved for elites. It belongs to everyone. It's sung in fields, played in kitchens, whistled on roads. The lyrics might be about saints or soup, unrequited love, or how your neighbor's cow looks suspiciously like the one that went missing last week. Later, you sit beside the lute player. She's restringing the instrument with the precision of a surgeon. You ask how long she's played. Since I could sit still, she says. My mother taught me. Her mother taught her. We're not nobility, but we remember things in melody. You nod. That feels right. Music here is memory, not written down in books, but carried in voices and verses. As dusk falls, the tavern doors open wide and lanterns are lit. Inside, the tables are pushed aside. Someone has cleared a corner for dancing. A jug of mead is passed around. The music shifts slower now, gentler. A ballad begins, the kind meant for swaying, for sighing, for leaning your head against someone's shoulder and pretending not to care when they sing off-key. You join a circle of dancers. Hands meet. Feet move in time. The song tells of a sailor who never returned but left behind a note, a tune, and a child who now sings in his place. You step outside for air. The stars are out. Someone plays a simple melody on a flute, barely more than a whisper. It drifts through the village, through windows and dreams, stitching everyone together in quiet harmony. You think of all the assumptions people have about the Middle Ages, that it was silent, grim, joyless, that music didn't exist outside monasteries. And here you are, drunk on sound and community, feet sore from dancing, heart humming with half-remembered tunes, not dark, not dull, but alive. You fall asleep in the hayloft above the tavern, tambourine tucked beside you, ears still ringing with the laughter and harmony of the day. Outside, the night is quiet, but if you listen closely, you can still hear it, a drumbeat, a hum, a song that never really stops. You wake to the dull ache of legs that dance too much, and a tambourine mark on your cheek that refuses to fade. Your joints crack as you roll off the straw-stuffed mattress, and you briefly consider spending the entire day lying very still. But there's commotion outside, something about a traveling surgeon setting up shop near the green. You limp to the window. yawn, and spy a cluster of villagers gathered around a man in a broad-brimmed hat, flanked by a helper with arms full of bandages and jars. You groan softly. It's medical time. You shuffle out and find yourself face to face with what looks like a makeshift operating theater, a wooden table, a stack of linen cloths, several instruments that gleam ominously in the sun, and a bucket you refuse to examine too closely. This is your introduction to medieval medicine, not some terrifying scream fest in a blood-splattered dungeon, but a relatively calm, pragmatic, and surprisingly thoughtful event. You take a deep breath. There will be no anesthesia, but also no screaming yet. The barber surgeon introduces himself as Master Oswald. He has sharp eyes, surprisingly clean fingernails, and a voice like gravel soaked in mulled wine. He's preparing to lance a swollen leg, possibly infected, possibly cursed, possibly both. You watch, curious and mildly queasy, as he cleans the area with wine, uses a razor-sharp blade to make a small incision, and then carefully packs the wound with honey. Nature provides. He mutters, "The bees know what they're doing." And that's your first revelation. Medieval medicine isn't all leeches and superstition. Sure, they believed in balancing the humors: blood, flake, yellow bile, and black bile, with an enthusiasm bordering on obsession. But they also recognized antiseptics, performed routine surgeries, and knew how to splint a broken arm without making things worse. Honey was used for its antibacterial properties. Wine cleaned wounds. Herbal poultice, fennel, tea, and willow bark, a precursor to aspirin, were common tools in a healer's kit. You sit beside the village midwife as she mixes a remedy for a local woman's aching joints, a blend of rosemary, ground mustard seed, and warm goat fat. She grins at your expression. "You'll thank me when you can still walk tomorrow." You believe her. She's patched up more legs than most knights have broken. You visit the apothecary next, an herbalist's den that smells of mint, vinegar, and mysterious optimism. The shelves are lined with dried plants, crushed minerals, and unlabeled jars filled with liquids in every shade of dubious. You pick up one labeled dragon's blood. The apothecary raises an eyebrow. "Tree resin," she says, "but don't tell the children." She teaches you to recognize common ingredients: yarrow for clotting, comfrey for bones, leona for nails, garlic for, well, everything. You help her prepare an infusion for a monk complaining of melancholy. The ingredients: chamomile, valerian, and one feather plucked from a hen on a full moon for mood. Whether that last part is symbolic or superstitious, she doesn't say, but the monk sleeps like a rock that night, down by the river. A bone setter is examining a shepherd's dislocated shoulder. With one swift, practiced move, he pops it back into place. The shepherd yelps, then mutters his thanks. "I told him not to wrestle goats," says the bone setter, wiping his hands, "but goats always win." You jot that down as a medical truth. Not all care is provided by professionals. Mothers pass recipes down. Nuns run infirmaries. Local women treat colds with onion poultices and recited prayers. Healing is communal, layered, and deeply local. There are no formal hospitals yet, at least not in this village, but there are hospices, almshouses, and roadside shelters run by religious orders. The monks nearby treat everything from wounds to toothaches, with varying levels of success and an aggressive policy of applying vinegar to everything. But yes, there are also the fringe remedies, the ones involving powdered unicorn horn, red coral, or spells muttered in dead languages. You attend a local fair where a man sells potions guaranteed to restore manly vigor. The potion smells like regret and licorice. You politely decline. Nearby, someone claims a cure for boils that involves burying a potato under the light of Mars. You note that down too, just in case. The tension between practical care and magical thinking is constant. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed in some of these remedies or just hoped really hard. You suspect it's not so different from your time where people chug wheatgrass and avoid gluten with equal fervor. That evening, you're invited to the local healer's cottage for dinner. Her name is Elswith, and her shelves are lined with scrolls, recipes, and a surprisingly accurate anatomical drawing of a liver. She serves you a stew made with nettles, wild garlic, and barley. Cleans the blood. She says, you eat cautiously and find it delicious. She talks about how she learned to read from a traveling monk who left behind a copy of Herbarium Apuleiae. She's memorized most of it. Elswith explains that diagnosis here is part science, part intuition. She watches people's habits, checks their pulse, examines their urine. Yep. And even listens to how they sleep. If they snore like thunder and wake up sour, she says, it's probably too much black bile. You ask if that's curable. With a purge and a good nap, you immediately regret asking. You sleep that night in her guest loft, surrounded by the smell of lavender sachets and dried rosemary. Outside, the wind rustles the trees. And somewhere, a night owl hoots like a very confused doctor. You drift off thinking about leeches. Yes, they're used, mostly to draw excess blood, but rarely in the overblown way people imagine. More often, it's about balance, observation. God, medieval medicine isn't perfect. It's a far cry from germ theory or antibiotics. But it's not chaos. It's a system, a mix of experience, inherited wisdom, religious belief, and patient trial and error. And sometimes, it works. You stir in your sleep, vaguely aware that someone's placed a heated stone at your feet. You smile. It's warm, comforting, and possibly therapeutic. Not dark, not hopeless. Just human hands trying their best. You wake to the clamor of bells, laughter, and the unmistakable sound of someone trying to play a recorder while running. Something's happening in the village. You throw on your tunic, grab your belt pouch, just in case anyone's selling snacks, and step into a scene that's part fever dream, part harvest festival, part community therapy session. Today is a feast day, and the entire village has collectively decided to stop working, start dancing, and possibly make questionable decisions involving ale and a maypole. The church bells are still ringing, long after their usual call to morning prayer, and ribbons flutter from every window. A trio of children dashes past you, faces painted with soot and streaks of crushed berries. You're almost certain one is dressed as a sheep. Nobody seems concerned. You follow the crowd toward the green, where tables have been laid with enough bread, cheese, apples, pies, and boiled things to cause a medieval food coma. Villagers arrive in waves, arms full of pickles and pride. A man with a large drum announces that the dancing will begin once the pig has made his speech, which makes no sense until a small pig in a flower crown is paraded through the crowd while everyone cheers like he's royalty. You don't question it. You cheer too. This is not a rare occasion. Medieval life, though rooted in toil, is peppered with feasts, fairs, processions, and holy days. And holy days, there are a lot of them. Some years, nearly a third of the calendar was dedicated to rest, celebration, or religious observance, though rest often meant stop harvesting and start juggling cabbages. Today's event, the Feast of Saint 2B, Maudwena, or maybe it's Saint Mildred, nobody's quite sure anymore. But it involves cider, a puppet show, and a game where you try to catch a goose while blindfolded. You wander past the baker's table, where someone is distributing sweet buns topped with bits of dried plum and something suspiciously crunchy. Across the square, musicians are warming up a fiddler, a pipe player, and a woman playing a portable organ that looks like it was invented by a very enthusiastic carpenter with poor impulse control. You join the edge of the crowd, just as the dancing begins, and this isn't your standard formal waltz. This is unbridled. Stomping, clapping, twirling chaos. A ribboned pole stands in the center of the green. Couples grab hold and weave in and out. Arms raised, faces red, feet pounding dust into the summer air. You're handed a ribbon before you can object, and find yourself tangled between a miller's daughter and a shepherd who claims his sheep can dance better than he can. The music speeds up. You spin. You almost fall. You laugh harder than you have in days. Later, you join a circle of villagers, watching a mummers play, a folk drama complete with hand-sewn costumes, wooden swords, a person in a very lumpy dragon suit, and an actor dramatically dying, only to be revived by the doctor, who insists his elixir is made from snails and divine favor. The crowd loves it. They know it by heart, but they cheer anyway. You catch yourself mouthing the lines by the second act. The feast stretches into the afternoon. Roasted meats appear: venison, boar, chicken stuffed with herbs and rice. Ale flows. A boy tries to balance an eel on his nose while his sister throws breadcrumbs at him. You sit on the grass beside an old woman who tells you about past feasts, ones with flaming puddings, goat races, and a man who once dressed as an angel and got stuck in a tree for 4 hours. You realize that these gatherings aren't frivolous. They're essential. In a world with hard labor, uncertain harvests, and no universal health care, communal joy is more than a break. It's survival. Diese festivals strengthen bonds, share resources, and keep the wheel of the year turning with meaning. Laughter isn't just fun, it's function. As evening nears, you wander into the tavern where the local musicians are holding court. The room pulses with rhythm, wood, smoke, and at least one off-key chorus of "Bring Us More Pie." A dance breaks out, and you find yourself partnered with the candle maker, who turns out to be deceptively nimble for someone who spends most of her day dipping wicks. She leads. You follow. The floor shakes. Nobody minds. Outside, lanterns are being lit, glass jars with candles inside, swinging from branches and windowsills. A group of children chases fireflies while singing a song about the moon losing its socks. A young couple kisses under the maypole while an older woman mutters, Give it 2 weeks, and we'll be baking a wedding loaf. You begin to understand that time moves differently in a village when it's marked not by hours but by traditions, feasts, and whispered prophecies about bread. There's a quiet magic in how joy is woven into the fabric of daily life, not just in rare exceptions, but rhythmically, seasonally. Often, feasts for saints, celebrations for the harvest, carnivals before Lent. The world is alive with ritual. Even grief is balanced with performance and prayer. People carve out time to remember, to laugh, to dance poorly but enthusiastically. You find yourself perched on a bench, sipping warm cider and watching a group of older villagers perform a circle dance, so complicated it might actually be an advanced form of math. You hear someone shout, "Wait, this isn't how we did it last year," and another respond, "Yes, it is. You were just less drunk." The fire crackles. The stars come out. Somewhere. The pig snores softly in his wreath. Back in your lodging. You settle under your blanket. Limbs sore from merriment. Your hair smells like smoke and cinnamon. Your stomach is full of bread, laughter, and minor regrets. Outside. The village quays. Tomorrow. People will return to their fields, their looms, their ledgers. But tonight they danced. You fall asleep smiling, remembering the ribbon in your hand, the fiddler's grin, the pie that definitely had something crunchy in it. Not grim, not joyless, just a world where work was balanced by wonder, and sometimes by a pig in a crown. You wake to the distant clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones, and the subtle realization that your calves still hurt from yesterday's enthusiastic attempt at medieval folk dancing. As you sit up, someone calls out in the street below, "The judge is here." You peer through the shutters. A tall figure in a travel-stained cloak dismounts beside the chapel. His entourage is minimal. One clerk, with an armful of scrolls, and a boy carrying a traveling bench. You blink. It's court day. You wander out with the rest of the villagers. Curiosity and a slight limp driving you toward the green, where a space has been cleared and the judge's bench hastily assembled. This isn't some dark dungeon filled with chains and despair. It's open air, sun-dappled, public. The judge, whose beard is so precisely trimmed it looks ordained, unfurls a scroll and nods. We begin. What follows is less like the harsh tyranny of medieval justice you've seen in movies, and more like an extremely polite community argument, moderated by a man who carries a wax seal and seems very tired. The first case. A dispute over a stolen chicken. The plaintiff, a woman named Agnes, insists the bird is hers because it comes when I whistle. The defendant, a man named Tobias, argues that it laid an egg in his yard, which by local tradition implies allegiance. The judge strokes his beard, then calls the chicken. It ignores them all and wanders off. Case undecided. This is your introduction to the medieval manorial court, a system that handled local issues, disputes, fines, land transfers, and general village nonsense. It was often held several times a year, presided over by a lord steward or itinerant official, like today's judge. Contrary to popular belief, justice here isn't all thumbscrews and torture chambers. It's mostly fines, oaths, community pressure, and people arguing about pigs A blacksmith is fined for letting his smoke blow into the Reeves garden. A shepherd is summoned for not repairing a broken fence. A boy is scolded for pelting the friar with berries. The court takes it all seriously, but with the air of long-suffering familiarity. Everyone knows each other. That's the point. This is justice not imposed from above, but woven into the social fabric. More serious cases, assaults, land disputes, theft are brought before a royal court or assize, which travels through the countryside. These proceedings are grander, more formal, and a little more intimidating. You hear whispers of one coming through next month, dealing with a merchant accused of selling false weights. He shaved 2 grains off every sack. Someone mutters, "That adds up." You nod. Math and morality. United in beans, you ask the clerk if trials ever involve duels or ordeals. He nods. Sometimes. Less. Now. The church frowns on it, and we ran out of firewood for trials by fire. You raise an eyebrow. Kidding. He adds, but you're not so sure. Trial by ordeal, like holding hot iron or plunging your arm into boiling water, was once a method to let divine judgment decide innocence. But by the 13th century, such practices were fading. The church grew wary of asking God to double as a forensic technician. You learn about compurgation, where accused people could bring in oath helpers, friends or neighbors who swore on their character. In small communities, reputation was currency. If you couldn't find 12 people to vouch for you, you were already halfway to guilty. Historians still argue whether this encouraged fairness or just made popular people untouchable. But there's no denying it tied law to relationships. By midday, the judge pauses proceedings for a meal. You sit near him and the clerk, eating bread with soft cheese and a few slices of cured meat wrapped in a leaf. He talks openly, without pretense. People expect justice to be dramatic. He says, but most of it is slow, quiet, one grudge at a time. You ask if it's hard. Of course. But what else can we do? Let the chickens sort it out. In the afternoon, the court resumes with more land boundary arguments. A case involving someone's ale tasting suspiciously like well water, and a dispute over whether a man's donkey truly trespassed into a neighbor's garden or simply stood very near it while looking rude. The judge rules that the donkey owes no penalty, but the man must help rebuild the damaged fence. Everyone seems satisfied. You watch as legal documents are sealed names, dates, transfers recorded in careful Latin. The clerk's handwriting is so neat it makes you feel personally attacked. Copies are stored in the manor roll, one of several records that track land rights, fees, debts, and who owes whom a bushel of wheat by Candlemas. As court on, the judge reminds the villagers that justice isn't about punishment, it's about balance, rights and duties, customs and exceptions. You feel a quiet respect for the system. It may not be perfect, but it's grounded in something older than law, the idea that people must live together. And that means settling things. Somehow, you walk back through the village. Pastors now open again. Neighbors chatting about the verdicts. No one seems furious. Some laugh. Some nod. One woman declares she's finally getting her hedge trimmed because of that official warning. And everyone cheers. That evening, you share a bench with the clerk by the fire. He lets you hold the seal, a heavy iron stamp that leaves a sunburst pattern in red wax. You ask him what happens when the law fails. He sighs. Then we tell stories about how it should have gone. And, next time, we try better. Not brutal, not lawless, but community justice with all its quirks, oaths, and misbehaving donkeys, trying to keep the peace one tiny case at a time. You sleep well that night, knowing your neighbors won't steal your boots, without at least a hearing. You wake with your head resting on a wax-stamped scroll you weren't supposed to be sleeping on. The clerk must have left it near the fire. And now you've imprinted the judge's seal into your cheek. Charming. You stumble outside, rubbing sleep from your eyes, only to spot a crowd gathering by the edge of the village square. The blacksmith is there, the miller, the scribe's apprentice, all standing awkwardly around a man in a leather apron, grinning beside a large wooden crate. He taps the lid dramatically, and everyone leans in. Behold, it declares the word machine. Inside is a marvel gears, wooden levers, tiny compartments cradling glistening metal letters. This is your first glimpse of the printing press. Well, not the press itself, not yet, but the movable type that will power it, change it, and maybe rewrite everything. Welcome to the start of a very slow, very loud revolution. You're looking at a replica of the device pioneered by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. And while his full press hasn't made it to this village yet, rumors of it have. More than rumors, actual printed pages. Crisp and uniform. Stacked neatly like magic you can hold. You pick one up. It's a page from a Latin grammar. You read a line. Your eyebrows lift involuntarily. It's legible. Every letter identical. Every line clean. No cramped scribe ink. No accidental doodles of knights fighting rabbits in the margins. Just pure, duplicated thought. The man with the crate is named Rolf, and he's an itinerant letter cutter. He travels from town to town making type for new presses. You carve it once. He explains, holding up a tiny metal A, and it prints thousands of times. No smudges. No monks cursing the dark. He winks. The local priest pretends not to hear. For centuries, books have been copied by hand. Slowly, painstakingly. One monk. One page. One ink stain at a time. Beautiful. Yes. Sacred. Often, but slow. You remember the illuminated manuscripts back at the monastery, how each took months, sometimes years, to complete. Now, with this little pile of movable type, entire books can be duplicated in days. You feel it in your bones. The world is about to speed up. Later that afternoon, you follow Ralph to the nearest city, where a small print shop has taken root in a former spice warehouse. The interior smells of old ink and ambition. Wooden presses dominate the room, each one looking like a cross between a wine press and a siege weapon. Apprentices scurry about with trays of type, inking rollers, and reams of linen paper. One of them offers you a square of cheese wrapped in a proof page from The Imitation of Christ. You read it while chewing. It's oddly moving. You watch as they set a form, tiny letters placed in rows, left to right, upside down and backwards. It's mesmerizing. A typo means the whole thing has to be reset. The apprentice winces. We don't make mistakes, he mutters. We make variants. You nod solemnly. He's clearly ready for the modern publishing industry. The press itself is operated by a thick-armed man who works with slow, practiced force. The inking pads thump. The paper is laid. The press is cranked down. The pressure squeaks. Then lift. Peel. A new page. Perfectly printed. You hold it. Still damp. The ink smudges slightly onto your thumb. You don't mind. You're holding mass communication. At first, the church and universities aren't sure what to make of it. Books. For everyone. What if the wrong people read the wrong things? What if the masses get ideas? But even the skeptics are tempted. Bibles are printed. Legal texts. Herbal manuals. Music sheets. Eventually, pamphlets. And it's those little pamphlets that begin to hum with something new opinion. You sit with the printer that evening. A man named Oswin with ink-stained hands and a grin like he's gotten away with something. He shows you a copy of a recent flyer, an argument about a bishop's decision to raise tithes. Used to be you just complained in the tavern. He says, "Now, you print it. 500 copies. Leave them in every pew." You whistle low. He nods. Not everyone's thrilled. But it's not all political. Recipes are being printed. Almanacs. Spelling guides. The Romance of the Rose. Slightly censored. Even playing cards. With rules included. Suddenly, knowledge isn't locked away in monasteries. It's on paper. In hands. On carts. Poor boys learn Latin phrases from discarded grammar books. Girls copy songs from pages wrapped around meat at the market. A world that once whispered its stories now begins to shout. You help set a block of type for a children's prayer book, carefully placing each metal letter until it spells something halfway legible. The apprentice nods. Good enough for rural distribution. You beam with pride. Your first print job. You immediately ask if you'll be paid in coin or cheese. He hands you another square of cheese. You don't argue. Later that night, you return to the village with a handful of printed pages. Folded into a crude booklet, you show it to the scribe. Expecting outrage. Instead, he reads it, chuckles, and says, "I can retire now, I suppose." Then he adds, "But they'll still need us to fix the mistakes." The tavern is quieter than usual, with a few villagers reading aloud from your new booklet. One man stumbles over a Latin phrase. A girl corrects him. Her friends giggle, and just like that, a new way of learning is born loud. Messy. Public. You sleep that night under a thatched roof, dreaming of metal letters marching across parchment, forming ideas, stories, revolutions. You realize the press isn't just duplicating ink. It's multiplying voices. Not slow, not stagnant, but printing its way into something astonishing, one page at a time. You wake to the scent of oiled leather and boiled oats, which can only mean one thing: the knights are back in town. You stretch, already regretting it, and shuffle to the window where a small crowd has gathered in front of the tavern. A young squire is attempting to unload an absurdly shiny breastplate from a mule, while his master, tall, broad, and apparently wearing 3 different animal furs, holds court like he invented the concept of valor. This, you quickly realize, is your first real encounter with the code of chivalry, that famous, romantic, endlessly complicated medieval set of ideals that never quite matched how anyone actually behaved. You follow the procession to the green, where the local lord is hosting a tourney. Not the full-blown, royal spectacle kind, with dragons painted on tents and bards, writing sonnets mid-joust. But a smaller village event where young knights practice tilting, swordplay, and remembering which end of a lance goes forward. The crowd is lively, the air thick with roasted onions, and someone's trying to sell wooden sword souvenirs for only 1 penny and a blessing. You're ushered into the viewing area just as the first mock duel begins. 2 knights circle each other, one clearly trying to maintain his chivalrous poise, the other already sweaty and visibly regretting his choice of chainmail under the sun. They clash swords. Sparks fly. Someone gasps. And then one knight trips over a chicken. The crowd erupts. It's glorious. But here's where it gets interesting. The idea of chivalry is everywhere talked about in ballads, preached from pulpits, painted on shields. Honor, loyalty, protecting the weak, upholding truth, serving ladies with grace and not too much drooling. But the practice, it's mixed. For every knight who writes poetry and refuses to strike a fallen foe, there's one who raids a neighboring village and claims the haystack as spoils of war. Chivalry was less a rigid rulebook and more a marketing strategy, equal parts idealism and image management. You sit beside a bard who's penning a song about the tournament. He's already decided who wins. Despite the match still going, that one, he points. He's got the cheekbones. You nod. Historical accuracy has never stood in the way of a good story. He recites a few lines, something about honor burning brighter than the sun, and a horse who cries tears of justice. You compliment his creativity. He offers you a plum and asks if you have a rhyme for valor. Nearby, a group of squires are polishing armor and trading stories of their knight's most noble acts, rescuing kittens from wells, refusing bribes of suspicious cheese, holding open chapel doors for nuns. One claims his master once fasted for 3 days because he accidentally insulted a goose. Another confesses that his knight fainted during a bee sting and still insists it was divine vision. You realize that the chivalric code, however uneven in execution, created a culture of accountability among warriors. A knight wasn't just a thug with a sword. He was expected to be literate, spiritual, and disciplined. Many trained in monasteries or noble households where they learned scripture, manners, and how to tell the difference between a dinner fork and a dagger. Chivalry was a social contract, not just between lords and vassals, but between knights and the wider society. Later that day, you attend a feast in the Lord's Hall, a reward for the day's bruises and blisters. The food is excellent. Roasted pheasant, glazed carrots, spiced wine. But the real highlight is the storytelling. Each knight takes a turn recounting a virtuous deed. Though most involve miraculous escapes, dramatic gestures, and a suspicious number of conveniently placed maidens. One knight boasts of defending a bridge against bandits armed only with a pastry and an unwavering stare. Another describes freeing a trapped deer with a single stroke of his sword. A young lady rolls her eyes, so hard you hear it. She later tells you she's composing her own tales, the ballads of Lady Marjorie, in which damsels rescue themselves and horses refuse to be ridden by fools. You ask to read them. She agrees. Eventually, still, the ritual matters. These stories embellished or not shape expectations. A knight who lies, cheats, or abuses. Power risks public shame. Word travels fast, especially when every tavern hosts a bard with loose lips and a lute. Reputation is everything. You meet a knight who lost his sword in a tavern bet and now serves as a household steward, until he earns back his honor. He pours your wine with a slight scowl. Later, you peek into the knight's tents where training continues by moonlight. One older knight corrects his pupil's sword stance with surprising gentleness, then quotes from the Song of Roland, to serve with courage and fall with grace. You watch as the boy tries again. Better, steadier, less chicken-in-the-road energy. You remember that not all knights were noble in birth. Some rose through service, proved themselves on the battlefield, and earned their spurs through grit and loyalty. Others were granted knighthood more for politics than piety. And still others bought it. Historians still argue whether chivalry was ever truly practiced or merely preached. But the tension between the ideal and the actual gave people something to aspire to, or at least something to argue about in verse form. As the night winds down, you sit near the fire where a bard is singing a love ballad that seems to involve a knight serenading a goose disguised as a princess. The crowd listens, sways, and pretends not to cry. You think about all the layers of chivalry, romance, religion, rules, reality. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always sincere. But it was a scaffolding, something to cling to in a world where might didn't always mean right, but at least tried to pretend it did. You fall asleep on a hay-stuffed mattress in the back of the squire's tent, still wearing your borrowed surcoat and holding a wooden practice sword that smells like cabbage. The night is quiet, the air cool, and the stars clear. Somewhere nearby, a knight recites a prayer before sleep. Another snores, like a sack of anvils. The bard hums softly by the fire, not savage, not lawless, but guided, however, imperfectly by a code that asked warriors to be more than muscle, to protect, to serve, to honor, even if they occasionally tripped over chickens doing it. You wake curled under a woolen cloak that smells faintly of campfire smoke and yesterday's stew. With the squire's borrowed practice, sword still awkwardly tucked under one arm, like a teddy bear made of bruises. The tourney grounds are quiet now, just scattered hay, a forgotten gauntlet, and someone snoring inside an overturned barrel. But your journey today won't involve lances or honor duels. No. Today you're heading to the local cathedral school, where the real action involves diagrams, debates, and one very enthusiastic lecture about the circulatory system, because, beneath the glittering armor and poetic gestures of the nightly class, lies another world entirely quiet, dusty, and filled with ink stains, the world of medieval science and learning. You walk along the edge of the town, where the bells of the cathedral ring out a calm, measured tone. A small building sits nestled beside the chapel stone walls, narrow windows, and a carved lintel above the door, featuring a lion, a serpent, and what you swear is a disapproving duck. Welcome to the School of Scribes and Scholars. Inside, it's cool and echoing. Parchment rustles, quills scratch. A young man with an ink-smeared chin offers you a stool and hands you a copy of Isidore of Seville's Etymologiae, which, according to him, is basically the medieval Wikipedia. You flip through it. There are entries on stars, fish, ethics, cartography, and whether snakes explode when cornered juries still out. You settle in for the day's lesson, natural philosophy, which is not, as you first assume, gardening. It's the closest thing the medieval world has to science. At the front of the class stands a scholar in a threadbare robe, passionately sketching planets onto a wax tablet. Remember, he intones. The earth sits at the center, surrounded by spheres, moved by angels, and filled with purpose. You nod slowly. Welcome to the Ptolemaic model, where the universe is an onion of perfection, and celestial bodies move in crystalline harmony. It's elegant, ordered, slightly wrong. Sure, but they didn't know that yet. You look around. Students are taking notes, muttering Latin phrases, occasionally poking each other with goose feathers. They're studying more than just planets. There's a class on arithmetic, where numbers are still wrapped in spiritual symbolism. 3 is divine, 7 is mystical, and 12 is organizational magic. Another on geometry, which they apply to everything from building churches to debating how many angels can stand on a pinhead answer. Depends on the width of their halos, but it's in the school's side room filled with charts, preserved herbs, and jars, labeled in 3 languages, that you find the real treasure, medieval medicine and science texts, being copied and debated. One scribe is translating a text by Galen. Another is arguing over whether blood originates in the liver or the heart. The liver makes it. Someone insists. No. The heart moves it. Another counters. You don't weigh in. Mostly because you're distracted by a woodcut showing a human with 4 extra spleens and a surprisingly fashionable beard. They show you a bestiary, a lavishly illustrated encyclopedia of animals, both real and imaginary. You admire the lion, snicker at the disappointed-looking pelican, and raise an eyebrow at a unicorn described as dangerously attracted to virgins. Next to it is a diagram of a plant with roots shaped like people mandrakes, which scream when pulled and may or may not ruin your day. You love it. You want 3. The scholar leading this room is named Brother Allard, and he's unusually open-minded for a man wearing a rope belt and sandals. He shows you his prized possession, a copy of Aristotle's De Anima, translated from Arabic, which itself had been translated from Greek. It traveled through 3 worlds to reach us, he says proudly, like wisdom with a passport. And that's the miracle you weren't expecting. So much of what medieval Europe learns about science, medicine, and the cosmos comes from beyond its borders via the Islamic world, which preserved and expanded on ancient knowledge during Europe's more chaotic centuries. You see Arabic notations in the margins, the faint tracks of earlier thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, whose writings on medicine and metaphysics are now part of these lessons. Knowledge, it turns out, doesn't care who borders whom. It just travels. Brother Allard lets you try a simple demonstration. You hold a pendulum, count the swings, and time it by chanting a psalm. It's not high-tech, but it's empirical. You measure, you observe, you ask questions, and slowly, you realize the seeds of the scientific method are here, not in full bloom yet, but taking root. You're invited to an evening disputatio, a formal debate where 2 students argue a point using logic and citations. Tonight's topic, whether the moon has influence over melancholia. The room is full. Someone's brought wine. The audience chuckles as each side quotes Aristotle, Galen, and someone named Berengar, who once swore his moods were tied to lunar cycles and his goat's behavior. The debate is lively, full of Latin and occasional sass. The conclusion: the moon may affect the tides of the mind, but not the soul. Applause. Bread is passed around. Someone plays a recorder badly, and no one tells them to stop. As the evening winds down, you browse the school's tiny library. The shelves are modest, but the range is wide: astronomy, agriculture, anatomy, even a book of riddles that makes you snort aloud. You spot one volume with a note that reads, "Do not remove, or you will be cursed with hiccups." You gently put it back. Later, you sit with Brother Allard beneath a sky so full of stars, it feels unfair. He points out constellations, quoting from Ptolemy, but also recounting folk tales, like the one where Orion is chased by a bear who turns into a kitchen ladle. Science and story, he says. Both try to make sense of the dark. You ask if he believes they'll ever truly understand the heavens. He smiles. Not fully, but each step matters. He shows you a chart tracking Mars over several weeks. The line isn't straight. It loops. Retrograde. He whispers. Not failure, just a new pattern. That night, you sleep in the dormitory, surrounded by students, scrolls, and the faint smell of ink and ambition. A candle burns low on the table beside you, flickering against a diagram of the 4 elements. You smile, knowing that somewhere down the centuries, someone will challenge all of this, and someone else will challenge them. Not stagnant, not foolish, just the beginning of something vast. One pendulum, one goat, one eager scholar at a time. You rise with the sun warming your face through the high dormitory window, tangled in a borrowed wool blanket and half dreaming of talking mandrakes and backward-spinning planets. The cathedral bells toll gently in the distance. But today, they're not calling you to class. Today you're traveling westward and south, past fields and woods, past rivers that carry more than fish, until the landscape shifts and the buildings change. Stone becomes stucco. Roofs flatten. The call to prayer floats faintly in the distance. You've arrived in Al-Andalus medieval Muslim Spain. The air smells different here. It's sharper, spiced with cumin and orange blossoms. The streets of Cordoba twist and wind like vines in a forgotten garden, and the tiles beneath your feet are cool and patterned in hypnotic blues and greens. You pass under a low archway into a courtyard where water trickles from a fountain shaped like a lion, surrounded by palms. It's peaceful, symmetrical, and impossibly clean. Someone offers you a date. You accept it with reverence. You've heard stories about this place, a land where Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side, or at least side by slightly annoyed side, building a culture of learning, music, architecture, and trade. You're not here as a conqueror or a tourist. You're here to learn, and what you find makes everything you thought you knew about the so-called Dark Ages crumble faster than wet parchment. Your first stop is the House of Wisdom, or rather, its local equivalent, a madrasa library hybrid in the heart of the city. Inside, shelves stretch from floor to ceiling, filled not just with Quranic texts, but with philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and poetry in Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. A young scholar shows you a translation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, complete with commentary by Averroes, one of the greatest thinkers of the age, an Andalusian polymath who dared to suggest that faith and reason could be compatible. Imagine that. You follow the scholar to a room where students gather on carpets with ink-stained fingers, scribbling notes, while a teacher lectures on Al-Khwarizmi's algebra. Yes, algebra. The word comes from his book. Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar, fi Hisab al-Jabr, wal-Muqabala, which roughly translates to the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, which is still a better title than most math textbooks. You listen as they solve problems using symbols and letters, building a system that feels like magic with logic. Your head spins a little. Next, you're taken to the observatory, a rooftop chamber with brass instruments, so finely crafted they look like jewelry. Astrolabes hang from hooks, intricate discs that map the stars, guide ships, and help determine prayer times. One scholar explains how they calculate the movement of celestial bodies with astonishing precision, using sine tables and spherical geometry, while sipping cold water from a carved cup and casually insulting Ptolemy. You sit beside a girl your age, learning to use an astrolabe. My mother taught me, she says proudly. She's an architect. You blink. Of the new mosque, she adds, as if it's the most normal thing in the world. Maybe here. It is. This city breathes scholarship. The streets are lined with bookshops, perfumers, and mathematicians arguing over coffee. You follow the aroma to a small cafe where scholars sip kahwa bitter, black, and awakening. This is the early form of coffee, and it's just beginning to sweep the Islamic world, fueling night-long debates and turning tired scribes into caffeinated visionaries. Over lunch lamb with saffron rice and mint, you talk with a doctor trained in both Galen and Avicenna, whose canon of medicine is considered a gold standard here and soon everywhere else. She explains disease with a clarity you weren't expecting. Humors, yes, but also anatomy, observation, and quarantine. Wash your hands, she says. Always. You nod like she's inventing the future. You visit a hospital. Not a grim ward of moaning patients, but a clean, tiled institution where the sick are separated by illness, examined daily, and treated with herbal remedies and careful attention. One wing specializes in eye surgery. Another has a garden where recovering patients rest in the shade. You help tend to a man recovering from a broken leg and watch as his physician gently adjusts his splint and offers him poetry to read. Healing the soul heals the body, she murmurs. You write that down. Back at the madrasa, you're invited to a poetry recital. Students recite verses from Rumi, Al-Mutanabbi, and others you've never heard, but instantly love. The language flows like water over stone. The poems touch on love, knowledge, justice, stars. One boy sings a verse that compares the night sky to a page of divine ink, and the moon to the margin's golden seal. You blink back a tear. A girl follows with a poem about truth being like a garden gate sometimes locked, often overlooked, but always nearby. And the architecture. Oh, the architecture. You visit the great mosque of Cordoba, where endless rows of striped arches stretch into the distance like a forest of stone and light. The symmetry, the carved arabesques, the mosaics that catch every ray of sun, they don't overwhelm. They invite. You sit in the courtyard as the sun sets, and the call to prayer ripples across the sky like silk. You begin to understand that this place, Al-Andalus, is not a footnote in European history. It's a cornerstone. Ideas born here: philosophy, science, language. A medicine will cross into France, England, Italy, shape scholars, feed universities, and quietly upend everything. Historians still argue how harmonious this coexistence truly was. There were tensions, of course, periods of tolerance, and periods of persecution, but what's clear is that this mixing of minds, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, produced a golden age of learning that Europe would spend centuries borrowing from, sometimes without admitting it. That night, you lie on a rooftop, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, listening to the sounds of the city distant singing, the hum of conversation, the flutter of pigeons settling for the night. Above you, the stars spin silently, traced and catalogued centuries ago by minds that believed knowledge was not just power, but praise, not backward, not dark, but luminous, with ink, with starlight, with the scent of coffee and cardamom. You wake to church bells in one ear and shouting in the other, a strange harmony of piety and protest. It's dawn, and the square in this particular corner of England is already alive with motion. Someone's dragging a cart filled with turnips. Someone else is standing on a barrel, yelling about unfair tallage while trying not to fall off. A woman is tying a red cloth around her wrist. And a barefoot boy hands you a smudged note that simply reads, "To the fields. Bring sticks." You blink. You've walked into a rebellion, and not a dramatic, kingdom-ending, flaming catapult rebellion. Not yet. This is something quieter, slower burning, but just as powerful. The voice of the lower classes rising into history's margins. You're here in the 14th century, just in time for what people will later call the Peasants' Revolt, or one of its cousins. There are many such uprisings, and they didn't come out of nowhere. You follow the crowd out past the village walls toward a muddy path that snakes through the trees. People from nearby hamlets join in, laborers, shepherds, brewers. That guy who never stops talking about barley yields. They walk with pitchforks, rakes, and wooden staves. Not exactly an army, but it's enough to send a message. One woman hoists a banner, painted with a sheep and a loaf of bread. Another holds a crude sign that says, "No more work without coin." You find it hard to argue with that. This moment didn't erupt overnight. It's the long echo of feudal burdens, crop failures, and most recently, the Black Death, which killed so many people that wages began to rise. Lords panicked. Parliament passed laws trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Peasants, now fewer and more valuable, refused. "We know our worth," someone mutters beside you, adjusting a hat made of what looks like aggressive felt to breast in. Back in town, someone starts reading aloud from a list of grievances, unfair taxes, arbitrary arrests. The Lord's nephew taking too many fish from the common stream. A crowd murmurs. This is part protest, part group therapy. But there's fire beneath it. You meet a man named Wulfric, a former plowman turned informal speaker. He's not a noble. He's not even especially tall. But he's clear, calm, and has the kind of voice people follow. God made all men, he says, standing on a cart. But man made lords. Let us unmake them. The crowd cheers. Then someone throws an onion in support. You're not sure if that's tradition or a snack. Rebellions in the Middle Ages weren't always violent, but they were always risky. Wulfric knows this. He speaks with purpose, never directly naming names, but everyone knows who he means. He quotes scripture. He invokes John Ball. The infamous priest who preaches equality and asks pointedly, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? You glance around. No one here feels like they need permission to question the order of things. You join a meeting in the alehouse later that night. It's loud, smoky, and tense. Maps drawn on scraps of parchment lie on the table. We march to London. Someone says, "We won't harm the king. Just ask him to listen." Someone else shakes their head. Ask or demand. It's a crossroads. History, sharpening its kill. Outside, the street is thick with whispers. You hear names Watt, Tyler, Jack Stroff, John Ball, real figures who'll soon become legends. Or warnings. Depending on who's writing the chronicle, some revolts are put down violently. Some succeed temporarily. Some just flicker, vanish, and reappear somewhere else in another form. But all of them challenge the idea that peasants are silent, that labor is invisible, that suffering should be patient. You speak with a widow named Ellen, who refuses to pay her death duty, a fee owed to the manor, when a tenant dies. Her voice doesn't shake. "I buried 3 sons last winter," she says. "The land fed us. Now I owe them for surviving." You say nothing. You just nod. She ties a knot in her kerchief and keeps walking toward the manor. At dawn, the local bailiff arrives, flanked by 2 guards. The crowd doesn't part. The bailiff reads from a parchment in a loud, quivering voice. Wulfric steps forward and answers calmly. "No more," he says. "The law has bled us long enough. We bled it back." For a long moment, no one moves. Then the bailiff folds the parchment and leaves. No arrests. Not yet. You follow the villagers to a field where they light a fire. Not for warmth, but for burning documents, records of debts, rents, dues, charters of chains. One man calls them. They go up in flames. The crowd watches in silence, not cheering, just breathing. Some are afraid, some relieved, some already planning the next step. You realize rebellions like this ripple through centuries. They're written in chalk, not ink scrubbed away by chroniclers loyal to lords. But they happened, again and again, from England to France, from Flanders to Italy, the Ciompi revolt in Florence, the Jacquerie in northern France, people rising not to overthrow everything, but to say we're here, and we're not quiet anymore. Later that evening, you sit with Wulfric beneath a tree. He sharpens his blade. Not with joy, but habit. "If we fail," he says, "they'll say we were fools. If we win, they'll say we were dangerous. Either way, they'll write the songs without us." You tell him you'll remember. He smiles. "Just remember we weren't shadows." You walk back toward the village. The road is muddy. The moon is low. You pass a sign nailed to a tree that reads, "Work for bread." Not chains. Below it, someone has scrawled, "And a day off on feast days." Even rebellion, apparently, respects the calendar. You sleep on the edge of the green, wrapped in a borrowed cloak that smells like fire and defiance. Around you, villagers whisper plans. No kings have fallen yet, but the people have stood. That's enough. Not forgotten, not voiceless, just peasants with pitchforks and purpose. Marketplace explodes into clatter. You lay on a pallet in a key at home. the walls thick with wattle and daub, the floor swept clean. A woman stirs beside the hearth, gently coaxing life into a small fire. There's bread rising in a clay oven, and a pair of goats outside, bleating their morning complaints. But today, no one's rushing to the fields or sharpening pikes. Today, they're dressing in their best. Because someone's getting married, you stretch, bones cracking, and rise into the rhythm of a medieval village wedding, not a royal spectacle with diamond crowns and choirs of imported geese, but a humble, bustling, strangely touching affair. And in its own quiet way, it reveals more about the Middle Ages than any battle or treaty ever could. The bride, Alice, is braiding flowers into her hair. Her gown is simple, but freshly laundered, and her neighbors have lent her a belt studded with little brass acorns that jingle softly as she moves. She's 19. She knows how to brew ale, trap rabbits, and argue about cheese prices without blinking. Herr Groom, Thomas, is already sweating nervously in his wool tunic, which is trying and failing to stay laced. They're marrying for love, mostly, also for barley. You step outside, greeted by the smell of rosemary, the sound of clapping, and the sight of half the village arranging themselves like a slightly disorganized parade. 2 boys are wrestling over who gets to hold the wedding broom. A third just yells, "I'm the bishop," and nobody stops him. In medieval Europe, marriage was both a sacrament and a social contract recognized by the church, bound by custom, and witnessed by the community. You don't need a cathedral or a priest, though it helps. But you do need words of consent. "I take thee," spoken freely, in front of others, was as binding as any inked parchment. Alice and Thomas stand in front of the chapel, hands clasped. Fatzes parle. The priest arrives late, muttering about spilled wine and lost sandals, but he smiles, blesses them, and ties their hands together with a red ribbon, the hand-fasting ritual. Around them, people cheer. Someone plays a lute with 2 strings, and a chicken walks calmly between their feet, as if inspecting the contract. After the vows, and the whole village moves to the green for what can only be described as joyful chaos. Trays of bread, roasted turnips, and boiled meats appear. Ale flows. Cheese wheels are sliced with the kind of reverence usually reserved for relics. The dancing begins with a slow, circular step that quickly dissolves into enthusiastic leaping, and one man trying to invent breakdancing centuries too early. You're pulled into the whirl by an older woman who tells you, mid-spin, that she's been married 42 years and only once considered feeding her husband to the pigs. You laugh too hard and nearly trip over the broom now being waved by the self-appointed bishop, who has also become the official pie distributor. These feasts are more than parties. They're community glue. Everyone helps. Everyone witnesses. Your marriage isn't just a personal decision, it's public, economic, familial. Dowries may change hands, sometimes land, sometimes livestock, sometimes a particularly well-behaved pig. But love matters too. You hear it in the way Thomas speaks to Alice, nervous but gentle, and the way she makes fun of him for crying halfway through the ceremony. You're invited inside the bride's home as custom demands. Here comes the bedding ritual, which thankfully today is symbolic rather than literal. The couple is led to their room by torchlight, accompanied by ribald jokes, awkward toasts, and someone banging a pan. They're not expected to prove anything in public anymore. Thank every saint. The crowd shuffles out. Giggling. The door closes. Peace. You sit by the fire with the bride's grandmother, who's sipping weak cider and smiling softly. People say our days are dark, she says. But every season we plant something, every spring, something grows. She waves a hand toward the now empty path. Sometimes it's beans. Sometimes it's a marriage. Later that night, back in the square, the dancing resumes. Children run barefoot in circles. Old men argue over whether the barley ale is better this year. A widow recites a riddle about a turnip that secretly wants to be a goose. It makes no sense. You love it anyway. Someone hands you a slice of spiced honey cake. Dense and warm. You eat it slowly, letting the cinnamon linger. The stars come out one by one, as if drawn by the laughter below. You sit on a hay bale, legs sore from dancing, heart strangely full. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't always rosy. There were forced unions, dowry politics, tragic pairings. Women's rights varied wildly, often restricted by local custom. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Many marriages were affectionate partnerships. Couples worked, danced, argued, raised children, and got through winters side by side. The closeness of labor and life often built deep bonds. You hear a girl whisper to her friend, "I'll marry a shoemaker," or a baker, or maybe just someone who likes dogs. They both giggle, hiding behind a jug. You smile. Not much has changed. As the fire dies down and the musicians pack up their battered instruments, Alice and Thomas reappear. Glowing, holding hands, the crowd cheers again, less rowdy now. More sleepy joy. A few people begin to sing an old folk tune. You don't understand all the words, but you hum along. Tonight wasn't about kings or crusades or plagues. It was about two people, a ribbon, and a village full of witnesses. The threads of history are woven not just through battles and scrolls, but through vows whispered beneath rosemary branches and the shared joy of surviving together. Not lonely, not loveless, but full of laughter, dancing, and the kind of love that smells faintly of baked leeks and ale. You wake to bells again, but this time their rhythm is slow, deliberate, almost tender, 3 tones. A pause. Then 3 more. You stretch on the pallet by the hearth, the room lit only by dawn, sneaking through a shuttered window. Outside, no one is shouting or dancing. The air feels reverent, like the town itself is holding its breath. You step out into the cool morning and find the villagers already gathered in the chapel yard. Heads bowed. Someone has passed, but this isn't a moment of fear or doom. It's something else. Grief. Yes, but also memory. Honor. Continuity. Today, you witness a medieval funeral. And in doing so, you realize the final, vital thread in the tapestry of this not-so-dark age, how they faced death with ritual, resilience, and more grace than they're often given credit for. The deceased is a woman named Maud. You didn't know her well, but everyone seems to have known her for something. She made a balm for bee stings. She could predict rain better than the abbey's weather bell. She once slapped a bishop for calling her goat too ambitious. Stories ripple through the gathering like incense. The procession begins with song, not professional choirs. Just voices. Ragged but true. The priest walks ahead, holding a wooden cross. Children scatter rosemary and lavender along the path. You walk near the back, listening to someone recite Psalm 23 in a whisper. Yea, though I walk through the valley, you finish it silently in your head, surprised by how the words settle in your chest. The cemetery lies just beyond the village, beneath a twisted rowan tree. The grave is simple. The coffin is pine. A few coins have been placed beneath the lid for safe passage, and Maud's walking stick lies beside it, worn smooth at the handle. Someone places a sprig of thyme inside, so she can remember who she is. An old man says, "There's no sermon about punishment, no thunderous doom, just a quiet liturgy and a reminder that to live well is the best prayer you can offer." After the burial, everyone gathers for a funeral meal, ordirjale, which is less somber than it sounds. Bread is shared. Broth is ladled. Maud's niece sings a lullaby she used to hum while carding wool, and you watch even the toughest old reeve dab his eyes with a sleeve. But the day isn't over, because funerals in the Middle Ages are also moments of spiritual connection between the living and the dead, the earthly and the divine. Later that evening, you visit the church again, where candles are being lit for a vigil. People kneel or sit in silence. The floor creaks beneath you as you settle on a bench. Someone begins to chant the Dies Irae, its somber cadence echoing through the cold stone. You think of all you've seen since arriving in this so-called Dark Age medicine. Learning, music, rebellion, love, death. It seems. Threads through all of it, not as a curtain, but as a turning wheel. Not the end, but a moment. And around that moment, people gather, tell stories, plant herbs, light candles. You hear about chantries, chapels endowed to say masses for the souls of the dead, about saints' relics, pilgrimages to pray for the departed, and even letters written to monasteries requesting prayer in exchange for donations. The medieval soul isn't abandoned after death, it's remembered, invoked, held. Historians still argue whether the Church's grip on death rituals was a comfort or a form of social control. But sitting here, in a chapel lit only by flickering flames and soft singing, you don't feel manipulated. You feel connected to something old, something human, something tender. Later, you join a few villagers walking home beneath a sky spilling over with stars. Someone recites a tale Maud once told about a ghost who refused to haunt anyone too polite. Another jokes that if she returns, it'll be to fix the jam cupboard she always said was crooked. You laugh, and in that laughter, she lingers. That night, you return to the same house, the same bed, and for the first time since your journey began, you feel the gentle weight of it, all the lives, the work, the songs, the prayers, not epic, not written in gilded pages, but real. And now, as we ease into the final stretch of this journey, let your thoughts drift with the slow rhythm of a medieval night. Imagine the village slumbering in peace, shutters drawn, hearths low, dogs curled at thresholds. Somewhere, a monk scribbles one last line in a margin. A midwife checks her pouch of herbs. A lover hums a tune in the dark. And a blacksmith, just barely awake, murmurs a prayer for his son's safe travels. Come morning, the wind moves gently through thatched roofs and quiet courtyards. Stars wheel above like the turning gears of some old, patient clock. You are wrapped now in centuries, not weighed down by them, but held, not barbaric, not bleak, but luminous, layered, quietly miraculous. Good night, fellow traveler. Sleep easy beneath your woolen blanket of time. And now, it's time to let go of the road beneath your feet. The flickering torches, the distant bells. Let the weight of your limbs sink softly into stillness, as if your body remembers what it's like to be a page tucked between centuries. The Middle Ages were never truly dark. They were stitched with quiet light clay lamps in humble homes. The glow of a scribe's candle, the shimmer of gold leaf on a prayer book. And even now, in the hush between moments, you can feel it, that ancient warmth wrapping around you like a woolen cloak. Let your breath slow, steady like footsteps on a woodland path. Inhale gently, as though drawing in the scent of rain-soaked earth or sweetbread cooling on a wooden table. Exhale slowly, and with it, release any tension. Like setting down a bundle at the end of a long journey, the village fades behind you. The chapel, the forge, the school, the market all slip quietly into dusk. There's peace in that simplicity. No screens, no clocks ticking too fast. Just the rhythm of seasons, the stories told by firelight. The comfort of belonging to a world where everything has its time, where even the stars take their turns. So close your eyes now. Let your mind drift, like smoke curling from an evening hearth. Whether you dream of illuminated manuscripts or haylofts under moonlight, know that you are safe, held by memory, by story, by the echo of 1,000 soft footsteps on cobblestones, worn smooth with time. Sleep well. My friend, the Middle Ages were never lost. They were always waiting quietly, patiently, just beneath the surface of dreams.